Today, I'm going to show you the 3 highest value strategies that you can study, learn, and invest time and energy into when you're early on in your poker career, or if you're a player that has been playing poker for a while but is struggling to develop, is struggling to take that next step so that you can make it to the next level. Poker is a game where the results are determined solely by the strength of the strategies that you deploy over your opponents over the long run. The game seems like a short-term game where you lose a hand, you played it badly, you win a hand, you played it great, but that's not the reality of this game. The reality is those are all just micro, little bitty pieces of the puzzle that you put together over the course of many months, over the course of years or decades, right? With that said, these 3 strategies are going to be the most valuable things that you can invest time and energy into if you want to make substantial progress in your game over a relatively short period of time. The strategies in today's episode are going to be more zoomed out. They're more macro, more broad, so that they apply to, many areas of the game tree, many different situations. So with that said, number 3 is going to be your pre-flop strategy. Every single hand that you play begins with pre-flop action. Pre-flop is the first phase, and it is the foundation that sets up your flop play, that sets up your turn, and then sets up your river, right? There's not going to be a highly technical player that is absolutely murdering online poker or even live poker that has a very flawed, very basic understanding of how pre-flop is supposed to work. With that said, there are players that are good enough to make deviations because they know the rules, so then that allows them to break the rules when the circumstance arises. But you should have a high-level understanding of how pre-flop works, what hands you have in different situations. And the reason why that's so critical that is that on the flop, as you're constructing your flop c-bet strategy, whether you bet, whether you check, what size you use, what boards you bet, you need to know what hands you have in your range. If you're doing something like consulting a chart and outsourcing that to something else, it's not in your brain. It's much more difficult for you to hand read. It's much more difficult for you to make high-level decisions and to construct strong strategies because you don't know the pieces that you're working with. And there's really no excuse to not having a strong pre-flop strategy in today's day and age. When I came up, there were no grids, there were no charts, there was nothing really informing me as to what my pre-flop strategy should be. So there was a lot of trial and error, a lot of making it up. These days, we don't have that problem. There's really no excuse so that you can set the stage, set the foundation for being a strong post-flop player. Now, the second zoomed out macro strategy that you absolutely have to get right that will have a dramatic impact in your win rate, your longevity, how much money you make per hour, both in live play, both in online play and tournaments, you have to learn how to crush white belts. White belts, for those of you who are unfamiliar to the channel, are new players, unstudied players, also known as, fish or whales or recreational or, fun players. I prefer the term white belt, but however it is that you describe them, you absolutely need to know how to crush white belts. If, you were training to be a professional NBA basketball player, you would be expected to be able to go down to your local Y and beat your average Joes, right? If you can't beat them, well, it's kind of hard to see the path to you making it to the NBA. So the weakest players in your pool, the white belts, you need to know how to crush them. Another reason is that it's much easier in this game to lose a lot of money very quickly than to win a lot of money. White belts tend to lose a lot more money on average per hand or per hour per 100 hands than a very strong reg will win. So for instance, a very strong reg is going to win about 10 big blinds per 100, and a white belt can lose 50 big blinds per 100. They can lose 100 big blinds per 100. There's really no cap as to how much money you can lose when you're playing very, very poorly. And so because white belts can lose money at a much faster rate, it is exceptionally critical that you're able to maximize your win rate against these players. And one thing you can do to get started right away is once you have, number 3, your pre-flop strat down, pay attention to white belts and their pre-flop strategy, right? Because it's not going to be optimal. It's not going to be what is expected. Some white belts will split their pre-flop open sizes by different amounts. So sometimes they raise to 5 big blinds, sometimes they raise to 3, sometimes they raise to 7, sometimes they raise to 2. At first glance can seem somewhat arbitrary, but as hands go to showdown and they open to, say, 6 big blinds pre and they show up with aces, right? Or jacks or queens, you realize like, oh, so their pre-flop strategy is that they're raising a larger amount with their better hands. So what does that mean when they raise a smaller amount, right? It means that their range is capped. And once their range is capped, they've removed all the best hands, the aces, the kings, the queens, the jacks from their range. And now they're playing a range that's made up more of mediocre type hands. This is the downside of not having a strong preflop strategy, is that you have these giant gaps, these giant holes in what you're doing that other players who are paying attention can exploit. This is just like one very easy example of how a white belt may mess up a strategy. They make mistakes all across the game tree. It is exceptionally important that you dial into doing whatever you can do in order to maximize your win rate against white belts, because honestly, very few things are going to move the needle more than that as it relates to, your growth and development, and your ability to earn money playing this game. And finally, the number one strategy that you should focus on as you're looking to make gains, improve your win rate, make more money per hour, become a stronger poker player, is going to be maximizing your value all across the game tree, in position, out of position, 2-bet pots, 3-bet pots, doing whatever it takes to maximize the amount of expected value of your strongest hands when villains have weaker hands. I'm going to give you a very simple example of how maximizing value may not be super intuitive. As a matter of fact, might be a little counterintuitive. Imagine that you have the nuts, right? So you have queen 10 and the board is ace, king, jack, XX. There's no flush available. You've got the nuts straight. There's $100 in the pot. You want villain to call. You want to make sure that your opponent calls. You've got $200 behind. You bet $50. Now let's imagine that your opponent calls 90% of the time. So 9 out of 10 times they call. I'm making these numbers up, by the way, as an example. I don't think there's a situation where opponents are actually going to call 90% of the time. That's a really high number. But this is just to show you, the math behind maximizing value. So you bet 50, gets called 90% of the time. You've got the nuts. The expected value of that bet is $45. $50 times 90%, which is going to be $45. So that bet that you made that gets called 90% of the time is worth $45. Now let's imagine that you chose a different size, right? You set a different price and you bet pot. So if you bet $100 into a $100 pot and it gets called half the time, so you went from getting called 90% to 50%. If you multiply 100 by 50%, the EV of placing that bet is $50. Right? So you make $5 on average more every single time you bet pot versus every single time that you bet half pot. Even though you get that hit of dopamine because your opponent calls and pays you off 90% of the time, the bigger bet is worth more money over the long run, right? And again, the name of this game is the long run. So by not sizing accordingly and maximizing value just in that one situation, you left $5 on the table. These sorts of value betting opportunities, spots where you can make an optimal size, you can price accordingly. The signal that you're pushing the envelope, the signal that you're on the right path, counterintuitively is going to be that your opponents are folding more when you have strong hands. I know that's not the thing that you would like to happen. I know that is a bad feeling, but if your value bets are getting paid off every single time you're making them, you're not going big enough. You're not going for max value when you have very, very strong hands. And so what happens when you don't go for max value, but you're playing against an opponent that does? Because poker is a game of strategy against strategy, if you're making 10 or 20% less than I am when I'm value betting, over the long run, I'm going to make more money with my best hands than you, which means that I'm going to make more money than you, period. And so if there's one strategy, one thing that you should focus on after you like, subscribe, and comment on this video, it is improving your value betting. It is pushing the envelope, making bets where, your opponents are folding, because that means that you're really getting after it, trying to find the edges, trying to find the maximum amount that villains are willing to call at the highest frequency that you can find. So to wrap up, we have number one, focus on maximizing value against all opponent types, all across the game tree. Number two, we have maximally beating the brakes off of the white belts that you encounter in your poker journey. And number three, as it relates to the macro strategies that are going to help you improve your game, that are going to move the needle, is learning, memorizing your pre-flop strategy, getting it down pat, being disciplined, executing on what you know, because that sets the stage, it sets the foundation for everything that happens after pre-flop. So with that said, that's all I got for you in today's episode. Again, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. If you have any follow-up questions as it relates to this video, be sure to leave them in the comment section below. And if there's any micro strategies that you'd like me to go into in a future video, let me know about that as well. This is Coach Brad Wilson, and I'll see you in the next video.
This is Chasing Poker Greatness with your host, Brad Wilson. Coach Brad approved. Are you a lone wolf searching for the ultimate pack? The CPG Wolf program is a close-knit brotherhood hell-bent on one thing only: chasing poker greatness. Powered by bleeding-edge wolf strats and led by Coach Brad and his lieutenants, CPG Wolves are systematically prepared for almost any spot they'll encounter on the green felt. If you want to plug into an elite team and have a step-by-step game plan to realize your full poker potential, you can apply at cpgwolves.com. Space is limited, and the pack is only as strong as its weakest member. So only the hungriest, grittiest, and most driven will be accepted into the program. Applications are open at cpgwolves.com.